The wind never stopped on Elijah Boone's ranch. It howled through the cottonwoods, rattled the barn doors, and whispered through the cracks in his lonely cabin walls. For 7 years, Elijah had worked this patch of land alone, mending fences, branding cattle, and talking more to his horse than to any living soul. But one evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, a letter arrived. It was from a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis. Inside was a photograph, a young woman named Tessa May, with delicate features, a shy smile, and a frame so slight she looked like the prairie wind might carry her away. Elijah stared at that picture for hours. He imagined her stepping down from a wagon, her small hands clutching a carpetbag, her voice soft as spring rain. He pictured her sitting by the fire, mending his shirts, maybe even laughing at his awkward jokes. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. He wrote back, sealing his hopes in ink, and sent the letter off with the promise of a ticket west. Weeks later, word came. She was on her way. Elijah spent the next days fixing the cabin roof, scrubbing the floors, and even buying a lace curtain for the one small window. He wanted everything perfect for the moment she arrived. But the prairie has a way of twisting a man's plans. And when the wagon finally rolled into his yard, the woman who stepped down was not the woman in his mind. The wagon creaked to a stop in a cloud of dust, the horses snorting and stamping as if they'd hauled more than they'd bargained for. Elijah wiped his palms on his trousers, heart thudding like a war drum. The driver hopped down first, tipping his hat. "Got your bride here, Mr. Boone," he said with a grin that carried a hint of mischief. Elijah stepped forward, eyes searching for the delicate figure from the photograph. But when the canvas flap lifted, the woman who emerged was different. Tessa May was not the fragile wisp he'd imagined. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried herself with the solid confidence of someone who'd worked hard all her life. Her dress strained slightly at the seams, and when she set her boot on the wagon step, the wood groaned in protest. She had a face full of color from the sun, eyes sharp as a hawk's, and a smile that was neither shy nor uncertain. It was knowing. For a moment, Elijah just stood there, caught between surprise and confusion. This wasn't the woman from the picture, or was it? The eyes were the same, but the rest was a world apart from what he'd built in his mind. Tessa glanced at him, reading his hesitation like an open book. "You must be Elijah Boone," she said, her voice warm but edged with something that dared him to say otherwise. He nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Ma'am, welcome to Boone Ranch." The driver unloaded her trunk, a heavy, battered thing that looked like it had survived a dozen journeys. Tessa lifted it herself, swinging it down with a grunt that made Elijah blink. As they walked toward the cabin, Elijah's mind churned. This wasn't what he'd ordered. This wasn't the dream he'd been polishing in his head for weeks. And yet, there was something about the way she moved, the way she took in the land with a steady gaze, that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Inside the cabin, she set her trunk down and looked around. "It's small," she said simply, "but it'll do." Elijah felt the wind shift outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere deep in his gut, he knew the prairie had just delivered him a storm. By the time the sun dipped behind the far hills, the cabin smelled of beans simmering over the fire and cornbread baking in the Dutch oven. Elijah had cooked for himself for years, but tonight every movement felt clumsy. as if Tessa's presence had rearranged the air inside the room. She sat at the small table, her hat resting on the bench beside her, hair pulled back in a thick braid. In the flicker of lamplight, Elijah noticed the calluses on her hands, the faint scars along her forearms, marks of a life that had known hard work and harder days. He set the plates down, trying not to stare. "Hope you like beans," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Tessa gave a small smile. "Beans kept me alive more than once. I'm not picky." She took a bite, chewed slowly, then looked him straight in the eye. "You were expecting someone else." The words hit like a hammer. Elijah froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. He cleared his throat. The picture, it was different. Her gaze didn't waver. "That picture was taken when I was 17. I'm 25 now. Life changes a person outside. The wind moaned against the walls. Inside, the silence stretched until Elijah finally nodded. "Guess it does." Tessa leaned back, folding her arms. "I didn't come all this way to be someone's disappointment. I came to work, to build a life. If that's not what you want, say so now, and I'll find my own way." There was no tremor in her voice, no plea, just a steady, unshakable certainty. Elijah felt something stir in him, something he hadn't expected. Respect. They finished the meal in quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet Elijah had known before. This one was heavier, charged, like the air before a summer storm. When she rose to clear the plates, he noticed how easily she moved in the small space, as if she'd already decided it was hers. And for the first time that night, Elijah wondered if maybe, just maybe, the prairie had sent him exactly what he needed, even if it wasn't what he'd asked for. The next morning broke under a sky the color of tarnished silver. The air was heavy, still, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of Elijah's neck stand up. Out here, silence wasn't peace. It was warning. He was mending a fence post when he saw it, a dark wall of clouds rolling fast over the plains, swallowing the horizon. The wind came first, sharp and sudden, bending the grass flat. Then the smell, that raw metallic scent of rain and lightning. "Tessa," he called, striding toward the cabin. "We've got a storm coming hard." "Get the animals in." She didn't hesitate. In seconds, she was out the door, skirts hitched, boots pounding the dirt. Together, they moved like they'd done this 100 times, though they'd barely known each other a day. She drove the chickens into the coop, latched it tight, then ran for the corral where the horses were already restless, eyes rolling white. The wind roared now, carrying grit that stung their faces. Elijah grabbed the bridle of his gelding, fighting to lead him into the barn. Tessa was on the other side, coaxing the mare in with a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the chaos. A crack of thunder split the sky. The gelding reared, nearly yanking Elijah off his feet. Before he could lose control, Tessa was there, one hand on the reins, the other on the horse's neck, speaking in a tone so firm and sure the animal stilled. Elijah stared for half a heartbeat, rain already soaking his shirt. "You've handled horses before," he shouted over the wind. "Handled worse than horses," she shot back, and there was no time to ask what she meant. They got the last of the animals inside just as the first sheets of rain slammed down. The barn rattled under the force of it, the roof groaning. Lightning flashed, turning the world white for an instant, followed by a boom that shook the ground. Inside the cabin, they barred the door against the wind. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists. The fire sputtered in the hearth, shadows leaping across the walls. Elijah poured 2 mugs of coffee, his hand still trembling from the rush of it all. Tessa took hers without a word, steam curling between them. "You work like you've been here your whole life," he said finally. She sipped, eyes on the fire. "I've been in places where if you didn't work, you didn't eat. Where if you didn't stand your ground, you lost it." There was something in her voice, not bitterness, but a weight, a history. Elijah wanted to ask, but the storm outside seemed to press the question back into his throat. Hours passed with the wind howling and the rain lashing the windows. At one point, a branch slammed against the wall, making them both jump. Without thinking, Elijah moved closer to her. She didn't step away. When the worst of it finally passed, the land outside was a mess of mud and broken branches. But the animals were safe, the cabin still stood, and Elijah knew one thing for certain. This woman was no fragile dream from a photograph. She was built for this land, for its fury, its loneliness, its demands. And maybe, just maybe, she was built for him too. The storm had passed, but the land still wore its scars. The prairie was a patchwork of puddles and torn grass, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Elijah spent the morning repairing the fence line, his boots sinking into the mud, while Tessa hauled fallen branches from the yard with the same steady determination she'd shown the night before. By midday the sun broke through, turning the wet fields into a shimmering sea. Elijah leaned on the fence post, watching her work. She moved with purpose, not wasting a single step. There was no complaint, no hesitation, just the quiet rhythm of someone who'd learned long ago that the world doesn't slow down for you. When the chores were done, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, the boards still damp beneath their boots. For a while, they just listened to the wind in the grass. Then Elijah spoke. "You said last night you've handled worse than horses." It wasn't a question, but it hung there, waiting. Tessa's gaze stayed on the horizon. "I grew up in a mining town in Missouri. My pa died in a cave-in when I was 12. My ma, she wasn't strong enough for the life that came after. I had 2 younger brothers to feed, so I worked where I could. Laundry, cooking, sometimes in the saloon kitchen, sometimes not in the kitchen." Her voice didn't crack, but there was a tightness in it, like a rope pulled too hard. Elijah didn't press. He knew enough about the West to understand what "not in the kitchen" might mean. "I married young," she went on. "Thought I'd found a man who'd keep me safe. Turned out he liked whiskey more than work. One night he didn't come home. Never found out if he left or if the river took him. Either way, I was alone again." She took a slow sip of coffee, eyes still fixed on the distance. "I stayed in that town too long. Folks have long memories, and they don't let you forget your place. I figured if I was going to start over, I'd do it somewhere so far away no one could follow." Elijah studied her in the fading light. The woman in the photograph had been a stranger. The woman sitting beside him now was something else entirely, forged in fire, tempered by loss, and still standing. "You could have gone anywhere," he said quietly. "Why here?" Tessa finally looked at him. "Because the ad said, 'Honest man, hard land.' I figured if the land didn't break me, maybe the man wouldn't either." The words settled between them, heavier than the storm clouds had been. Elijah felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not even admiration exactly, but a recognition. This was a person who understood what it meant to fight for every scrap of dignity the world tried to take. They sat in silence for a long while after that, the sun dipping low, painting the prairie gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and though neither of them said it, Elijah knew this was the first time since she'd arrived that they weren't just two strangers bound by a letter. They were two survivors, sitting side by side on the edge of a land that would test them both. The days after the storm were restless ones. The prairie had a way of pretending to be calm while quietly plotting its next move. The grass swayed in the breeze, the sky stretched wide and blue, but Elijah could feel it, that low hum in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. Tessa worked beside him without complaint, but there was a distance in her eyes now, as if part of her was somewhere else entirely. She'd told him pieces of her past, but Elijah knew there were still shadows she hadn't let him see. It was on the fourth day that trouble came riding in. Two men on horseback appeared at the far edge of the property, their silhouettes sharp against the sun. They didn't ride like neighbors, they rode like men who wanted something. Elijah's gut tightened. He stepped off the porch, shotgun resting easy in his hands. Tessa came out behind him, wiping her hands on her apron, her gaze narrowing as the riders drew closer. The lead man was tall and lean, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that didn't blink enough. The other was younger, but his smirk carried the same kind of danger. "Afternoon," the tall one said, reining in his horse. "Name's Cutter. This here's my brother, Wade. We're looking for a woman, name of Tessa May." Elijah felt Tessa stiffen behind him. "What for?" he asked, his voice flat. "That's between her and us," Cutter said, "but she's got something that belongs to us. We aim to take it back." Tessa stepped forward then, her voice steady. "I don't have anything of yours, and I'm not going anywhere with you." Wade chuckled low. "You always were a liar, Tess. You think running out here to the edge of nowhere's gonna keep you safe?" Elijah's eyes flicked between them. "You best turn your horses around. This is my land." Cutter's smile was slow and cold. "Your land don't mean much when there's no one left to work it." The air between them thickened. Elijah could feel the weight of the shotgun in his hands, the beat of his pulse in his ears. He didn't know exactly what history Tessa had with these men, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to hand her over. "You heard me," Elijah said, his voice low. "Ride on." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cutter spat in the dirt. "We'll be back, and next time we won't be asking." They turned their horses and rode off slow, like men who wanted you to know they weren't afraid. When they were gone, Elijah turned to Tessa. "You gonna tell me what that was about?" She met his gaze, her jaw tight. "They worked for my husband, the one who disappeared. He owed them money, a lot of it. When he vanished, they decided I was the payment. I left before they could collect." Elijah felt a slow burn in his chest. "And now they've found you." Tessa nodded once. "They won't stop. Men like that never do." The wind picked up, rattling the porch boards. Elijah looked out over the land, his land, and then back at her. "Then we'll be ready for them," he said. For the first time since she'd arrived, Tessa's eyes softened, not with relief, but with something fiercer, trust. That night they worked side by side in the dim light of the lantern, checking the locks, loading the rifles, setting the dogs loose to patrol the yard. The prairie was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a fight. And Elijah knew, deep down that whatever happened next would decide not just the future of his ranch, but whether he and Tessa would stand together or be torn apart by the past she'd tried to outrun. The night before they came back, the prairie was too quiet. No coyotes called, no wind stirred the grass. Even the horses shifted uneasily in the barn, as if they could sense the weight of what was coming. Elijah sat at the table, cleaning his rifle for the third time, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. Across from him, Tessa was sharpening the old skinning knife, her movements slow and deliberate. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the way they'd worked side by side all week. When dawn broke, it came with the sound of hoofbeats. Two riders again, Cutter and Wade, but this time they weren't alone. A third man trailed behind, heavy-set, with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. They rode straight up to the porch, dust curling around their boots as they dismounted. Cutter's smile was the same as before, slow, cold, and certain. "Mornin', Boone. We've come for what's ours." Elijah stepped out, shotgun in hand. "Ain't nothing here belongs to you." Wade spat in the dirt. "You think you can keep her? You don't know what she's done." Tessa stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the morning air. "I know what I've done. I've worked. I've fought. I've survived. And I'm done letting men like you decide what I'm worth." The scarred man laughed low. "You talk big for someone who's hiding behind a rancher." Elijah's jaw tightened. "She's not hiding. She's standing right here. And if you want her, you'll have to go through me." The standoff stretched, the air thick with the smell of horses and dust. Cutter's eyes narrowed. So be it. He reached for his gun. The world seemed to slow. Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Tessa moved. She stepped off the porch, knife in hand, her voice ringing out like a whip crack. "You take one more step, and you'll find out I'm not the girl you remember." Something in her tone, steady, unflinching, made Cutter pause. Wade shifted uneasily in his saddle. The scarred man's smirk faltered. Elijah saw it then. These men weren't used to being challenged, not by someone who looked them in the eye without fear. Cutter's gaze flicked between them, weighing the odds. Finally, he spat again, the sound sharp in the stillness. "You're not worth the trouble." They turned their horses and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance until the prairie swallowed them whole. For a long moment, Elijah and Tessa just stood there, the morning sun warming their faces. Then Elijah lowered the shotgun, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You didn't have to step in like that," he said quietly. Tessa sheathed the knife. "Yes, I did. I've been running long enough. I'm done." They went back inside, the cabin suddenly feeling different. Not just a shelter, but something stronger, something shared. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Elijah sat on the porch with Tessa beside him. The land stretched out before them, endless and untamed, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. "You know," he said, "when I sent for you, I thought I was getting someone small and delicate, someone who'd need me." Tessa glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And what did you get instead?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Someone who makes me stronger than I ever was alone." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk wheeled against the fading light. And in that quiet, Elijah realized the truth the prairie had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about getting what you expected. It was about standing beside the person who'd face the storms with you and knowing you'd do the same for them. The land would test them again. The storms would come. But now they'd face it together. And in the wild, unforgiving heart of the West, that was the only kind of promise that mattered. Well, partner, if you've ridden with us all the way to the end of this tale, you've got the true grit of a frontier traveler. If you enjoyed this story, don't just ride off into the sunset. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next adventure out here on the wild prairie. Give this video a like if it kept you hooked till the last word, and help the campfire conversation keep burning by dropping a comment below. Tell me, what moment from this story stuck with you the most? Was it the storm, the standoff, or something quieter in between? Your thoughts and memories are the gold nuggets that keep this channel alive, and I read every single one. So saddle up, join our growing posse of story lovers, and let's keep riding together into the next chapter.